Followers were bound together by a sacred oath. They sang a pilgrim song. They wore badges showing the 5 wounds of Christ. And Aske himself gave the movement its title, the Pilgrimage of Grace. From now on, the rebellion spread with quite amazing speed. In 2 short weeks, Aske had occupied York, the capital of the north. At about the same time, Cumberland and Westmoreland had risen. 5 days later, Pontefract Castle, the key to the north, had been surrendered by Lord Darcy. Lord Darcy quickly threw in his lot with the rebels, and Pontefract became a rebel centre, the place where the pilgrims' policies were finally agreed. But on the day of the castle's surrender, the king dispatched a small force to hold the River Don. A week later, a huge force of rebels marched south and confronted the Duke of Norfolk across the river. Outnumbered by nearly 4 to 1, all the Duke could do was to temporise. He called a truce and promised the rebels to present their grievances to the king. But what exactly was it that the rebels wanted? In their final petition, they asked for the restoration of the Princess Mary to the succession, the restoration of the old religion, and the restoration of monks to their monasteries. They wanted heretics, Cromwell, and other unpopular ministers punished. They demanded the repeal of the Statute of Uses and other new laws, an end to certain taxes and the king's manipulation of Parliament, a Parliament in the north, and, not surprisingly, a free pardon. Quite a mixture of demands. Professor Elton, one of our foremost authorities on Tudor administration, does not believe that religion was at the heart of the Rising.
Professor Elton, you seem to see the origin of the Rising as more to be found in London than in the north itself. Now, why is that?
Well, in the first place, the people who stand forth as really behind the leadership were not northerners, though they had property in the north. People like Lord Darcy, that old soldier of the Tudors, who was in fact a follower of Queen Catherine, the late Queen by this time, and the Princess Mary, Lord Haigh, also associated with Mary's circle, whose arrival in Lincolnshire was very recent. So these were London court people of the Tudor court, and they had been engaged in the faction strife of the court throughout the previous 6 years, with the climax in early 36, in a war, so to speak, that they had lost. But they were still a political faction of the court, and they transferred themselves to the country where there was now their last remaining possible power base.
Well, what was this factional strife about?
The strife was about the future of the country, really. There was a problem about succession to the crown, thanks to Henry VIII's curious matrimonial adventures, and there was a party that wanted the Princess Mary, later Mary I, to retain the succession, but she had already been written out of it.
How do you know that Darcy and Hussey were involved?
Both Darcy and Hussey had been conspiring with the Emperor's ambassador, who was the center of all the conspiracies against the new line, for something like 3 years. And about 2 years before the pilgrimage, Hussey had in fact told that ambassador that the right way to do it was to get the people up first and then pretend the gentry and church came in after, which is exactly what happened.
So you're saying the Rising was not spontaneous?
When you look at the events, you can see that they aren't just coming out of their holes and saying we're rebels. There's leadership. And the most important leadership in the north was that of Robert Aske, who, it must be admitted, was probably the only one who believed in the religious coating given to the rebellion. But Aske's story, as he tells it, won't work. It's quite out of the question that it should have happened the way he says. He says he crossed into Lincolnshire, hadn't known there was a rebellion on a day when the king, 300 miles away, knew all about it, sent a message which in effect was a signal for stopping the rebellion in the north. Unless that was prepared, nobody would have taken notice. So it must have been different from the way they told it. And they had to tell it differently from the way it was if they were to save their lives after the defeat.
Is there anything in the list of grievances which tends to substantiate your theory?
I think so, yes. They're a very mixed batch, great variety of interests and concerns. There are demands concerning religion, which are peculiar because although some are very simple, let's have the old ways back, they also attack a number of obscure continental reformers, of whom certainly the peasantry had never heard. There had been no English translation of their works, for instance. But in the main, there are these demands of a political nature for the succession, for the restoration of a parliament other than the parliament which had just done all the things they didn't want done, an attack on the faction led by Thomas Cromwell in court, and a rather interesting, surprising, manifest effort to avenge the death of Sir Thomas More.
Have you any positive evidence for this?
Well, they're people who cannot be explained otherwise. That is to say, either people involved, like George Stones, who drew up the first articles for Lincolnshire, who was a member of the Moore Circle, or people attacked, like Christoph St. German, who wasn't a heretic, as they called him, and John Rastell, ditto, both of whom had fallen out with Moore.
Can you explain what these people hoped to achieve by manipulating a rising?
Yes. The conspiracy, as we've called it, didn't want a rising. It wanted a threat. The idea was that you got things worked up to the point where you could tell the king, unless you change your ways, there's going to be endless trouble. How about seeing sense? Pressure, lobbying pressure put on the king. It got out of hand very quickly because there was enough real despair and apprehension and disagreement flooding the north, right through the people there, to make certain that the leadership couldn't control it.
Do you think this kind of lobbying could ever have worked?
I think probably at this point couldn't, but the interesting thing is that it, in a sense, anticipates later political developments. You get it very striking in the later 17th century, and then it becomes the party organization of the 18th and 19th.
Well, whoever was really behind the rising, the Duke of Norfolk continued to negotiate with the rebels in the north. On December the 8th, the Duke met with Aske and persuaded him that the Pilgrims' demands would be discussed by Parliament and granted them the royal pardon. Within a few days, that great host had disappeared. But in Lancashire, the rebellion simmered on. Here, rebels carried out a number of Aske's aims, such as restoring monks and canons to their monasteries and priories, like this one at Cartmel. And they were quite prepared to use force of arms in defence of their action, if need be. The king couldn't admit that there was opposition to his religious policies, so he tried to make the rising look as if local peasants were struggling against their landlords. But Dr. Christopher Haigh, who has studied the Lancashire pilgrimage in detail, sees it as strongly religious in form.
What grounds have you for thinking that the monasteries were central to the Lancashire Rising?
In Lancashire, specifically, I think there are four main indicators that the monasteries were crucial. The first is the geography of the rebellion. Those areas of Lancashire which rose in rebellion during the pilgrimage were those where the largest, most active and most popular monasteries were concentrated. That is, the north of the county and the east of the county. Secondly, I think the timing is crucial too, both in terms of the beginning and the end of the pilgrimage. At the beginning, the pilgrimage begins in Lancashire 5 weeks after the monks were thrown out of their monasteries. And towards the end, the pilgrimage continues in those areas around the monasteries. Everywhere else is all quietens down, people go back to their houses, and the rebellion is over. But in the monastic areas, people are pretty busy, active, defending the monasteries against any threat. Thirdly, the rebel propaganda. Those tracts, circulars, which the rebels produced to try and bring more people into the rising, all concentrated on two related issues: the defence of the church in general and the defence of the monasteries in particular. And that's what they thought would bring people into the rebellion. And lastly, I think the government agreed and made it perfectly clear that they knew that the pilgrimage was about monasteries in Lancashire, because when the official clean-up campaign took place afterwards, it was all focused on the monasteries, and it was the monks in the main who were executed for their participation.
Would you say that it was the suppression of the monasteries in Lancashire that resulted in the rebellion?
It isn't just Lancashire where the suppression was a disruptive problem, because in general it's pretty unpleasant. We have, after all, in 1536 got 2,000 redundancies among monks, 2,000 men thrown out of their monasteries without very much hope of future employment, with very little redundancy payoff, and with, of course, no unemployment benefit, since the monks who were rejected in 1536 were not given pensions.
Why should the people have risen in support of the monks?
I think we tend to exaggerate the division between monks and people. We tend to think of monks secluded behind high walls in monasteries, but that's not what monasteries were like in the 16th century. They were very much involved in local life, very much involved in communities. The monks themselves were often local boys recruited into the monastery and then spending their lives there as monks. The monasteries were landlords. They often supplied vicars and curates for local churches. They were very much involved in and contributing to local life.
But it was not in Lancashire, but at the Scottish border town of Carlisle, that the final flare-up occurred. In February 1537, the Commons, distrusting the King's promise of pardon, mustered on their own, attacked, and were defeated. Sadly, this gave the King the excuse he'd been looking for. He revoked his pardon. 78 of the rebels were hanged here, or hereabouts. Later, a further 100 were executed, including Darcy, Hussey, and Aske. So, what had the pilgrimage been all about? We asked the latest historian to go into print on this matter, Clifford Davies. What were the main issues at stake in the Pilgrimage of Grace?
I think there was interaction and fusion of several issues which had emerged over the last couple of years. Henry's reforms in religion, in taxation, in law, all worked together, apparently, to undermine the basis of local society. On top of that, there had been a bad harvest. There were fears about the economic future, especially the chance of an absentee landlord, the Crown replacing the landlord people knew, namely the monasteries. But the most important thing, I think, was the question of the parish church and its furnishings and its fittings, gold and silver chalices, images, that sort of thing, which people had paid for themselves out of their own pocket, their ancestors had paid for, and in which they had intense local pride.
The historians you've heard seem to have arrived at slightly different interpretations of both the causes of the Pilgrimage of Grace and the groups or individuals that lay behind it. If you want to build your own picture, a good starting point is to consult primary sources, which our historians used. We've published a selection of sources in this book. If you've got a copy, you can use it to help form your own conclusions about the issues at stake.
The risings resulted from the efforts of a defeated court party to establish a power base in the country in order to win a political victory at court.
The pilgrimage resulted from the interaction and fusion of several different grievances, but the most important single angle was the parish church one.
The pilgrimage, I think, is much more closely related to the suppression of the monasteries than some historians think.
All Lincolnshire people felt that there'd been much too much change recently, and every bit of that change had interfered in local county affairs.
Alack, alack, for the church's sake, for commons wake and no marvel, for clear it is the decay of this, how the poor shall miss no